The moment I realized my mother might not survive the winter, I was standing in the Shoppers Drug Mart parking lot in -20, reading a printout of her lab results that her new husband had casually left on the kitchen counter, face up, like it was a grocery receipt. That detail still haunts me. Face up, like he wanted me to see it, like he wanted me to know he already had. I should back up. My mother's name is Elspeth. She is 61 years old. She makes the best butter tarts in Lanark County. And for 32 years, she raised me alone in a house on Drummond Concession Road with a wood stove that smoked and a well pump that froze every February, and a stubbornness about her that I have always admired and occasionally wanted to shake her for. She didn't date much after my father left. A few dinners here and there, nothing that stuck. She said she didn't need anyone. She said the house was enough. She said I was enough. Then she met Clifton. I was 28 when he came into the picture. I'd moved back home the previous spring, not because I had to. I had a job, a decent one, doing accounts payable for a civil engineering firm in Perth. But because my mother had been having dizzy spells and her family doctor was booked out 6 weeks and the nearest walk-in was 40 minutes, and I didn't want her driving on the highway alone in the dark. That was supposed to be temporary, 3 months me before. I was still there when she introduced me to Clifton Marsh. He was 58. Retired, he said, from project management. Vague enough that I didn't know what to picture. He had a silver truck and clean hands and the kind of easy confidence that fills a room without you noticing, until you realize everyone in the room is facing him. He brought flowers the first time he came for dinner. Not grocery store flowers, a real bouquet arranged with a card. He said, "Your mother talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." I thought that was sweet. I wrote it down in a text to my best friend the next morning. He seems genuinely lovely, which I know is exactly what I'd say before finding out he's a serial killer. Lol. I wasn't wrong about the serial part. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. He moved fast. That's the first thing I tell anyone who asked. Within 2 months, he was at the house 3 nights a week. Within 4, he had a drawer in the bedroom. By the time October came around, he was talking about winter driving conditions and how it would just make more sense if... And I remember him shrugging like the idea had just occurred to him, casual, unrehearsed, if he was just here full-time. For the season. My mother said it made sense. She said the driveway needed clearing and the furnace had been making a sound. She said she was 61 and she'd been alone long enough, and didn't I want her to be happy? I did. I genuinely did. I told myself the unease I felt was just adjustment. Jealousy, maybe, or the particular weirdness of sharing your childhood home with a stranger. I told myself that him asking to be added to her checking account, just to help with bills, just so he could transfer money without waiting, was practical. She'd all been bad about online banking. It did make sense. I just wish I'd paid more attention to what making sense was slowly costing her. The first sign I noticed was the tiredness. My mother had never been a tired person. She was up at 6, she gardened, she walked the road in rubber boots in the rain. But that winter she started sleeping until 9, then 10. She said she was fighting something off. She said the cold got in her bones differently now. She laughed about getting old, and I laughed too, and I told myself I was watching her too closely, being anxious, catastrophizing. Then came the stomach trouble, then the headaches, then a week in February when she didn't get off the couch for 3 days and I wanted to take her to Kemptville Hospital, and Clifton said she was fine, she just needed rest, and I was overreacting. That was the first time I felt something sharpen in my chest. Not fear exactly, something quieter. Like a door I didn't know was open had just clicked shut. I took her to the doctor anyway, not her regular one. I drove her to the walk-in in Smith Falls a Tuesday afternoon while Clifton was at the hardware store. The doctor ordered blood work. Routine, she said. Probably nothing. The results came back to the house by mail. Clifton brought in the mail. By the time I saw the envelope, it had already been opened and the printout was on the kitchen counter, face up in the cold fluorescent light, And I stood there in my coat, reading words I didn't fully understand but understood enough, elevated levels, inconsistent with dietary causes. Recommend follow-up with specialist. Refer urgently. Urgently. I took out my phone and photographed the page before I put it back exactly where it had been. I didn't say anything to Clifton that night. Or the next night. I sat with what I knew and what I didn't know, and I did what I always do when I'm scared. I made a list. I wrote down every symptom I'd noticed, with dates going back to October. I wrote down the lab result language and looked it up. I wrote down the specialist referral and called the doctor's office myself the next morning and said I was calling on my mother's behalf and needed to know if the referral had been sent. It hadn't. The doctor's office had sent it to the fax number on file, which was my mother's landline, a landline that Clifton had switched over to a VoIP service in November. I asked if they could resend it to a different number. They said they needed written consent. I said I'd have my mother call. I hung up and I stood in the driveway in the cold for a long time. Here is the thing about realizing something terrible. It doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps. It comes in through the gaps you didn't know were there. I didn't wake up one morning knowing what Clifton Marsh was. I woke up one morning knowing that whatever he was, I needed to be quieter and more careful than I had ever been in my life. I did not confront him. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. Because every instinct I had was screaming at me to walk into that kitchen and throw him out of my mother's house. But I had nothing concrete. I had a lab result I wasn't supposed to have seen, and a fax that hadn't arrived, and a feeling in my sternum that felt like swallowing broken glass. That is not a police report. That is not a court case. That is a daughter who is scared and scared and angry daughters get dismissed. So I was strategic instead. I told my friend Tamseen everything. She's a nurse at the Queensway Carlton, and she understood the lab language better than I did. She went quiet on the phone for a long time, and then she said quietly, "Get your mom out of that house." I said I was trying. I started small. I convinced my mother to come to Ottawa for a weekend. I said I wanted her help choosing furniture for my old apartment, which I hadn't moved back into yet, but she didn't need to know that. I got her away from him for 2 days, and I took her to a clinic there. A different one, under the cover of getting her flu shot updated. And I asked the intake nurse privately if she could flag the file for any specialist follow-up that the patient's husband might not be notified about. The nurse looked at me for a moment and then said she would note it. That weekend, my mother slept 9 hours, both nights, and said she felt better than she had in months. I drove home with her on the Sunday, watching her face and thinking about all the ways I had been slow. The confrontation I hadn't planned came in March. I had taken my mother to a follow-up appointment. The specialist in Ottawa who had finally received the refer through a different route. And I'd had to park the car and run back to feed the meter, and when I got back to the waiting room, Clifton was there. He had driven 90 minutes without telling either of us. He was sitting next to my mother with his hand on her knee and a smile on his face. And when I walked in, he looked at me with something in his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite a warning, but was in the same neighborhood as both. He said, "I'm her husband. I should be here." I said, "Nobody told you the appointment was today." He said she did. My mother looked at the floor. I sat down across from them, and I did not say another word in that waiting room, and I did not look at him again. But something clarified in me then, the way water goes clear when the sediment finally settles. I understood exactly what I was dealing with. He had been monitoring her phone, her calendar, her movements. He had made himself indispensable, and then he had made himself the gatekeeper, and my mother, who was tired and sick and possibly being made that way deliberately, had handed him the keys without realizing what she was handing over. The specialist's report came back 2 weeks later. My mother's file now had a secondary contact on it, me, and the clinic called my cell. The specialist used careful language. She said the results were concerning and she wanted to discuss them with my mother in person, ideally without her husband present if possible, and could I help facilitate that? I said yes. I did not tell Clifton about the appointment. Tamsin came with us. She sat in the corner of the room, and she held my mother's hand, and the specialist explained in very plain terms what the blood work was showing and what the possible causes were and what she was going to recommend reporting to the appropriate authorities given the pattern of results. My mother did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "He makes my tea every morning." The specialist nodded slowly. My mother started crying. I didn't sleep much that week. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding a secret that is also an emergency, from moving carefully through a house where someone dangerous lives, from watching your mother try to process the possibility that the man who brings her tea every morning has been poisoning her. Slowly, over months, I kept my face neutral at dinner. I said the right things. I helped with dishes. I did not look at the mug she drank from. What I was doing in the margins of all of that was building a file. I photographed the lab results. I saved every voicemail from the clinic. I made a written log of every symptom, every date, every time I had tried to get my mother to a doctor and been discouraged. I contacted a legal aid clinic in Kingston and spoke to a family law paralegal named She told me to call her Barb, and Barb told me that what I had was a start, but that I needed to involve the police and not wait. I asked what would happen to my mother if I went to the police too soon and it fell apart. Barb was quiet. Then she said, "What's happening to her right now if you don't go at all?" I called the OPP. I want to say it was a single dramatic call that set everything in motion. It wasn't. The first officer I spoke to was patient but clearly unsure what to do with a daughter calling about a husband she suspected of deliberate poisoning with no criminal record, and the wife who had not yet made a statement herself. He gave me a file number. He said he would flag it for follow-up. I called back 3 days later and asked for the detectives unit. That conversation was different. The detective I spoke to, a woman who sounded like she had heard this exact story before and was quietly furious about it, told me to bring in what I had. I drove to the detachment in Perth on a Thursday morning with a manila folder and a USB drive and sat across from her for an hour and a half. She asked careful questions. She took notes by hand. At the end, she said, "You did the right things in the right order. That matters." I cried in my car afterward. First time I'd cried through any of it. What the investigation turned up was worse than I had been ready for. Clifton Marsh had been married twice before. The first wife, a woman in Barrie, had died 4 years ago of what her death certificate listed as complications from a chronic illness that had developed. The detective told me this gently, approximately 14 months after she married Clifton. The second wife, in Sudbury, had separated from him 18 months ago. She had agreed to speak to investigators. She had symptoms she had never been able to explain. She had spent 2 years trying to convince herself she was just prone to illness. She was not prone to illness. There was also the money. When the financial investigators started pulling the thread, it unraveled fast. Clifton had persuaded my mother to add him to her accounts. He had, over 7 months, transferred just under $34,000 to a personal account she had no access to and had not known about. He had cashed in a small RRSP she had from her years working at the township office, the one she'd been keeping for emergencies, without her signature, using paperwork that investigators later described as altered. He had taken out a credit line against her car. He had been paying his own storage unit, his phone bill, a gym membership in Brockville, all from her accounts, all quietly, all disguised in the transaction history as services or utilities. My mother had not been checking. She had trusted him. He was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon in April. I know because I was at the house. I'd found a reason to be there. I'd been finding reasons to be somewhere near my mother every day for 3 weeks. And I watched from the kitchen window as the OPP cruiser pulled up the driveway. Clifton was in the garage. He came out looking annoyed, like it was an interruption. And then his face changed when he saw the second officer come around the side of the house, and I watched the annoyance become something else. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table. She didn't get up. She just held her mug in both hands and stared at the table, and I put my hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and covered my hand with hers, and we stayed like that until we heard the cruiser pull away. She said, "I feel so stupid." I said, "You are not stupid. You are trusting. Those are not the same thing." She nodded, but I don't think she believed me yet. The charges were serious: fraud over $5,000, forgery, criminal negligence causing bodily harm, upgraded later after the Barry file was reviewed in consultation with the Crown. His first wife's death was being reinvestigated. The Sudbury woman had given a full statement. There were investigators. I was never introduced to working on things I was only told about in fragments. At the bail hearing, the Crown opposed release. Tifton stood there in the Perth courthouse in a button-down shirt, looking like someone who had been inconvenienced, and his lawyer argued he was a low-flight risk with community ties. And the justice of the peace listened to the Crown's summary of the financial trail and the medical evidence and the second marriage, and denied bail. I sat in the second row and I did not look at him once. The preliminary hearing took 4 months. My mother gave a statement. It was hard to watch. She is a proud woman and privacy matters to her, and sitting across from lawyers and answering questions about her finances and her health and her bedroom was not something she would ever have chosen. But she did it. She did it clearly and calmly, and when the Crown asked her to describe the morning she found out what Clifton had been doing, she said, "I felt like I'd been asleep." And I was angry at myself for sleeping. The Crown said that was not her fault. My mother said, "I know, but it takes a while to feel it." Clifton eventually pleaded guilty to fraud over $5,000, forgery, and criminal negligence causing bodily harm. He had apparently been advised that the reinvestigation of the Barry death created significant exposure and that a trial would not serve him well. The sentencing happened on a grey Thursday in November. I took the day off work. Damson came. My mother's neighbor, a woman named Gretchen, who had brought us soup every week for 4 months and asked no questions, drove down from the concession and sat in the back. The judge took 40 minutes. She spoke about breach of trust and deliberate exploitation of vulnerability and the particular cruelty of targeting a person's faith in another human being as a mechanism for harm. She sentenced Clifton to 6 years in a federal penitentiary. She also issued a restitution order for the money. My mother will probably never see most of it. That's the part no one tells you. That financial restitution orders in fraud cases are often unenforceable because by the time the courts get involved, there's nothing left to collect. My mother's RRSP is gone. The money in the accounts is gone. She is 61 years old and she is rebuilding something that took 30 years to build, and it is not fair. But she is here. Her blood work is normal now. She is back in the garden. She got a new pump for the well, and a neighbor's kid cleared the driveway all winter, $40 a visit, and she said it was the best money she'd spent in years. Last spring, I helped her put up a new mailbox. The old one had rusted through, and she painted the post herself, yellow, and stood back and said, "There, something that's mine." I took a picture of it. There is one thing I want to say before I'm done, because it is the thing I have thought about the most in the months since all of this ended and started and ended again in the way that these things never fully end. When I was in the thick of it, when I was logging symptoms at midnight and photographing lab results and driving to Perth to talk to a detective while pretending to go to the grocery store, I wanted to tell someone how to not end up here. I wanted there to be a list, warning signs, a checklist. Something that would have helped my mother see him earlier, or helped me act faster, or helped someone, somewhere, do something that would have meant 6 years instead of 2 without. But I don't think it's that simple. The people who do this are good at it. They are patient and practiced, and they know exactly how to make helping feel like love, how to make control look like care, how to move slowly enough that by the time you notice the walls are closer, they have been closing for months. What I know now is this: your instincts are data. That thing in your chest that goes quiet when something is wrong. That is information. You are allowed to act on it before you have proof. You are allowed to be wrong. Being wrong is survivable. Being too late is harder. My mother is okay. That is the sentence I come back to when everything else gets heavy. She's okay. She is 61 years old and she's in her garden in Lanark County, and she's okay. The butter tarts, for the record, are still the best in the county. She entered them in the fall fair in October and came second and said the judging was corrupt, and I laughed for the first time in what felt like a long time, and that too felt like something coming back.